Just 5 years after the nuclear devastation at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world faced a new nightmare. For the first time since World War II, a fresh conflict erupted. This one fully fought during the Cold War. In Korea, a single people, united for centuries, was torn apart. 21 nations became involved, an alliance mosaic that forever altered the peninsula. 3 years of ferocious combat, over 2 million troops deployed, and more than 3 million casualties, both soldiers and civilians, nearly 10% of the Korean population at the time. Could the planet truly endure another cataclysm so soon? How could this happen? What interests and politics lay behind the international intervention? And why, more than 70 years later, has that war never truly ended, still shaping our world today? Under the Joseon dynasty, from 1392 to 1897, Korea experienced centuries of unified and relatively stable rule. Spanning roughly 220,000 square kilometers with a late 19th century population nearing 13 million, the peninsula stretched between the Yellow Sea to the west and the Sea of Japan to the east. Its capital, Hanseong, today Seoul, was strategically placed in the northwestern part of the peninsula. In 1897, after internal reform attempts and outside pressures, Korea proclaimed itself the Korean Empire, seeking to modernize its political structures. Yet the peninsula soon became a focal point in geopolitical rivalry among China, Russia, and Japan. Japan's victory in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War led to a protectorate over Korean territory, imposing strict limits on local sovereignty. In 1910, with Japan's formal annexation, a lengthy colonial era began, one that would reshape all of Korea. The country lost its autonomy and entered a new chapter under foreign dominance, forever altering its historical trajectory, a transformation felt across every province. Following the 1910 annexation, Japan imposed a harsh colonial regime in Korea that lasted until 1945. Public use of the Korean language was banned, while land and resources were seized to exploit the region's agricultural and mineral wealth. This policy widened the gap between the north, where factories and hydropower plants were built, and the south, which remained predominantly agrarian and lacked a solid industrial base. A key moment of resistance was the March 1st movement, Semeul-undong, in 1919, a mass protest demanding Korean independence. Though violently suppressed, nationalist sentiment grew stronger, driving many to exile or underground struggle. Meanwhile, Japanese occupation intensified. During World War II, over 200,000 Koreans were conscripted into Japan's military, and it is estimated that more than 200,000 Korean women were forced into sexual slavery in so-called comfort stations. In the north, certain communist activities received military and strategic support in Manchuria, among them Kim Il-sung, who, with Chinese training, several hundred fighters in total, possibly over 1,000 at various stages, and Soviet aid, formed well-organized guerrilla units capable of striking across the border. His rising stature drew new recruits and resources, setting the stage for future leadership. Elsewhere, both secular and Christian nationalists operated, creating a mosaic of resistance groups that, however fragmented, kept alive the spirit of independence. By the late 1930s, Korea's population exceeded 20 million, mostly engaged in agriculture, weakened by Japanese requisitions. As Allied forces advanced in Asia, aerial bombings hit strategic northern cities such as Hamhung and Wonsan, damaging the industrial infrastructure Tokyo had established on Korean soil.
Did you know that most people who watch our documentaries aren't subscribed yet? If you enjoy animated maps and history, join our community. Leave a like and subscribe so you never miss the next episodes.
In August 1945, Japan's surrender ended 35 years of formal occupation in Korea, yet genuine autonomy did not immediately follow. At the United States' proposal, accepted by the Soviet Union, the line separating their respective spheres of influence was drawn along the 38th parallel. To the north, the Red Army entered mainly from the Andong area, now Dandong, in China, and from the region near the Truman River, basing Soviet operations in Pyongyang. To the south, American forces landed at Incheon and Pusan, taking military and administrative control, with Seoul as their principal hub. This occupation was meant to be temporary, guiding Korea toward a single government, but stark disagreements between Washington and Moscow soon made any joint administration unworkable. The North, home to around 9 million people at that time, hosted most of the heavy industries, such as chemical factories, steel mills, and coal mines. Intense land reform and nationalization policies were introduced under Soviet oversight, fueling local communist leaders' popularity. Among them was Kim Il-sung, already noted for his guerrilla activities in Manchuria, who gradually tightened his hold on the region's political and economic apparatus. Rural communities in the north benefited from more equitable land distribution, while urban centers swiftly reoriented production to serve Soviet interests. The south, with an estimated population of 15 million, remained predominantly rural, though it boasted strategically vital ports like Pusan and Incheon. Here, the U.S. occupation confronted growing social unrest, marked by popular demonstrations and violent clashes with government forces. Many leftist groups faced repression, while other factions openly embraced anti-communist policies. In 1947, the United Nations tried to organize free elections across the peninsula, but the North boycotted the plan, deeming Western involvement illegitimate. The following year, 2 separate states were formally established. In the South, the Republic of Korea led by Syngman Rhee, an ardent anti-communist prepared to unify the peninsula by force. In the North, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea under Kim Il-sung. This split, fueled by the mounting hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union, shaped the boundaries of a fracture bound to erupt into an even more devastating conflict. With the gradual withdrawal of U.S. and Soviet troops between 1948 and 1949, military presence in Korea dwindled to just a handful of advisors in each zone. Despite that, tensions ran high. Both the Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea claimed to be the sole legitimate government of the entire peninsula. Along the 38th parallel, frequent clashes caused over 10,000 deaths, especially near Kaesong and Korwon. In the north, the army exceeded 130,000 troops, bolstered by around 150 T-34 tanks and plentiful Soviet-supplied light and heavy artillery. In the south, however, available soldiers numbered fewer than 100,000, mostly lightly armed and lacking any significant armored force. For Kim Il-sung, military superiority was pivotal. Aiming to reunify the peninsula by force, he sought support from Stalin and from China's newly established communist government. His close ties with Mao Zedong, cemented after the 1949 communist victory, secured a safe rear base for the north, along with training and supplies from beyond the Yalu River. Indeed, Mao's rise strengthened the Socialist Front in Asia, prompting the initially cautious Stalin to back the North Korean plan more openly. During that same period, global alignments were shifting swiftly. Europe was experiencing the Marshall Plan era and had just emerged from the 1948-49 Berlin blockade, while 1949 also saw the creation of NATO. In Asia, China's communist triumph placed the Korean peninsula in a far broader ideological contest, where Washington and Moscow tested their global clout. The South, militarily disadvantaged, relied on American support, though signals from Washington proved ambiguous. In January 1950, Secretary of State Dean Acheson delivered a speech excluding Korea from America's Pacific Defense Perimeter, the so-called Attrition Line. Kim Il-sung read that omission as a green light to act, moving the peninsula ever closer to open conflict, intensifying the likelihood of an armed confrontation in a region where rival ideologies threatened to clash at any moment ahead. In the spring of 1950, following protracted talks with Kim Il-sung, Stalin approved a plan to invade South Korea, provided Mao Zedong was ready to step in if required. Although he did not immediately commit regular troops, Mao promised political and logistical assistance, reserving direct intervention for when circumstances demanded. Encouraged by this socialist backing, the North amassed more than 135,000 soldiers near the 38th parallel, alongside over 150 T-34 tanks and hundreds of Soviet-made artillery pieces. In the South, fewer than 100,000 troops were available, mostly lightly armed and lacking armor. South Korean intelligence had noted suspicious troop movements close to the boundary, yet neither the scale nor timing of the offensive was fully grasped. At dawn on June 25, 1950, around 4 a.m., the North Korean army unleashed a multi-pronged assault, catching an unprepared southern defense off guard. Seoul fell within 3 days, triggering a vast civilian exodus and widespread panic behind the lines. At that moment, the Soviet Union was boycotting the UN Security Council over China's seat, thus unable to veto U.S. proposals. Capitalizing on this, the United States secured a resolution authorizing military involvement in Korea. A UN-backed coalition formed, with 16 member nations, including the US, UK, Australia, Canada, Turkey, and more, deploying troops on the ground. The North Korean invasion ignited the first major armed crisis of the Cold War. Washington responded decisively, sending large forces and materiel, convinced Seoul's fall was just the opening act of a conflict poised to reshape East Asia's balance of power. Western alliances, tested in Korea, would remain pivotal for years to come, laying the groundwork for a shifting global order defined by intensifying ideological rivalry. The peninsula's fate now hung in the balance, as opposing blocs squared off over strategic footholds and competing visions, launching a war that would ravage cities, divide families, and ultimately leave a legacy of bitterness and division still felt on the Korean peninsula to this day, with no resolution in sight. Within weeks, the North seemed posed to triumph, yet events took an unexpected turn when U.S. forces counteract and UN troops arrived. The war, locked in an armistice, has never truly ended, leaving the Korean peninsula divided to this day. When dawn broke on Sunday, June 25, 1950, the roar of tank treads and gunfire shattered the stillness along the 38th parallel. Over 135,000 North Korean troops, backed by more than 150 Soviet T-34 tanks, poured towards Seoul, a mere 60 kilometers away. Confronted with such overwhelming force, the South Koreans, fewer than 100,000 ill-equipped men, saw their defenses collapse within hours. It was the start of a lightning war that would upend the entire Korean peninsula. Taken by surprise and lacking armor, the South Korean lines quickly gave way. In 48 hours, the front disintegrated as thousands of civilians fled south. Bridges over the Han River, which cuts through Seoul, became bottlenecks for a massive exodus. By June 28th, in just 3 days of fighting, the capital fell to the north. Scenes of panic and chaos marked the authorities' hurried evacuation. Many residents, unprepared, abandoned homes and possessions, hoping to find refuge further south. The swift fall of Seoul exposed the huge military gap between the two Koreas and shocked international opinion, which was only then grasping the conflict's grim seriousness. As Seoul fell to northern forces, the UN Security Council passed a resolution to protect South Korea. The Soviet Union's absence, caused by its boycott over the Chinese seat dispute, prevented any veto, enabling the United States to lead an international coalition. By July, the first American units arrived under General Douglas MacArthur, finding the South Korean army pushed into the country's southeastern tip. The Pusan Perimeter, around the port of Pusan, now Busan, became the final bulwark against the North's advance. With fewer than 150 kilometers of front, this area defended the only hubs for UN supplies and reinforcement. Fighting was intense, and though outnumbered, the defenders fought on stubbornly. U.S. troops brought modern artillery and tanks, with air power offering critical cover. Despite heavy casualties and mounting pressure, the stand at the Pusan Perimeter held firm, allowing new international contingents to arrive and paving the way for a determined counteroffensive. While the Pusan Perimeter held off the North Korean onslaught, General Douglas MacArthur proposed an amphibious maneuver called Operation Chromite. The aim was to land at Incheon, on the peninsula's west coast, exploiting erratic tides and natural obstacles to catch enemy forces off guard. Many American strategists deemed it a risky plan. Incheon featured steep cliffs, treacherous seabeds, and dramatic tidal swings, any of which could turn the assault into a disaster. Yet MacArthur trusted the North Koreans would assume an amphibious landing there was impossible. At dawn on September 15, 1950, the landing began. Over 260 U.S. and Allied ships, including British, Australian, and Canadian vessels, carried more than 70,000 men onto Incheon's beaches. At the forefront, the 1st Marine Division, with 22,000 troops, and the U.S. 7th Infantry Division, with 25,000 soldiers, formed the core amphibious force, backed by South Korean units. Allied naval guns pounded artillery positions, while Australian and South African air units, flying over 150 aircraft, carried out strategic raids to suppress North Korean anti-aircraft defenses. The defenders, focused on the Pusan line, never expected an invasion from the west and were caught completely off guard. Within hours, the beachhead was secured, allowing additional Allied forces to land, including Turkish, French, Belgian, and Greek detachments tasked with fortifying supply routes in the rear. Meanwhile, from the south, South Korean and U.S. troops launched a pincer move, trapping numerous retreating North Korean units. Thanks to surprise, overwhelming firepower, and multinational coordination, Seoul was retaken in just 3 days, September 28th. The operation had a resounding media and morale impact, demonstrating the UN's determination and strategic edge, reversing the tide of a conflict that only weeks earlier had seemed lost to the South. This success significantly improved Korea's prospects under UN support. After retaking Seoul, the UN command decided to push north of the 38th parallel to unify the peninsula under South Korean rule. In early October, the UN and the Republic of Korea, ROK, Army, deployed forces along several axes towards the Chinese border. The western route led from Seoul through Kaesong and Pyongyang via the Gyeongchul Railway and the Taedong River Valley. In the central sector, U.S. and Allied units crossed the Chorwon Highlands, while in the east, reinforced South Korean troops moved on Wonsan and Hamhung. With air supremacy provided by roughly 1,000 American, British, and Australian aircraft, interdiction raids destroyed bridges and rail lines, hampering the withdrawal of some 80,000 remaining North Korean troops. In rear areas, Turkish, Canadian, and French infantry units secured newly liberated zones, while Eastern Front South Korean forces, now at 120,000 strong, aimed for the Truman River to cut off any escape northward. On October 19th, with the entry into Pyongyang, UN forces captured thousands of enemy soldiers, over 10,000 prisoners in the first 3 days alone. Many in Washington and Seoul believed the war could end by Christmas, given Kim Il-sung's massive setbacks. Diplomatically, however, China grew alarmed at Western troops nearing its border and prepared a major intervention. In secret talks with Stalin, Mao Zedong resolved to send hundreds of thousands of volunteers to support the North, judging a pro-Western regime on Manchuria's doorstep unacceptable. The euphoria of Pyongyang's fall masked a stark truth. The war was about to enter a more unpredictable and bloody phase. As UN forces pressed forward beyond the 38th parallel from late October into November 1950, a new foe appeared. On October 25th, UN patrols encountered Chinese troops along the Yalu River, which marks the boundary between North Korea and Manchuria. They were the Chinese People's Volunteers, sent by Mao Zedong to prevent any pro-Western regime from forming on China's doorstep. The influx of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, over 300,000 by some estimates, aimed to shift the war's balance in the North's favor. Its impact was devastating both psychologically and operationally. Already worn down by weeks of advancing through mountainous terrain with poor infrastructure, UN forces now faced a numerically superior foe skilled in nighttime infiltration. Many outposts along strategic valleys and passes, such as the Yalu Corridor or the Incheon Highlands, crumbled under waves of Chinese infantry driven by fierce ideological resolve and aided by weak UN intelligence. The sudden appearance of Chinese columns on ridgetops, often cloaked in mist and dense forests, made their assaults all the more lethal. Logistically, US, South Korean, and other Allied forces had to supply thousands of troops and vehicles along ever longer, vulnerable routes. Roads were mostly unpaved, bridges lay in ruins, and below-zero temperatures hindered every move. Northern sectors like the Chungcheong River Valley or the Kengai and Manpo areas demanded escorted convoys and constant repairs per kilometer. With China's entry, the war turned multinational, paving the way for one of its harshest, bloodiest phases. Combat now spanned national borders, intensifying an already brutal conflict whose outcome would echo far beyond the peninsula. The Chinese intervention caught the Allies off balance, reshaping strategic possibilities. The massive Chinese offensive unleashed in November overwhelmed UN lines near the Chungcheong River, forcing a rapid pullback. At the Chosin River, Chongjin, the U.S. 1st Marine Division and Allied units found themselves outnumbered by over 120,000 Chinese troops. Frigid temperatures, often below minus 30 degrees Celsius, made every movement a desperate ordeal. Here unfolded one of the Korean War's most legendary clashes. Though they suffered thousands of casualties, some estimates cite over 4,000 dead from wounds, combat, or frostbite. 30,000 U.S. Marines managed to break through the encirclement. Major General Oliver P. Smith, commanding the American forces in the area, refused to call it a retreat, describing the maneuver instead as an advance in another direction. Despite their courage and resilience, the price in human lives was enormous. The 1st Marine Division alone recorded more than 10,000 dead, wounded, or frostbitten. Strategically, UN lines took a crushing blow. The entire northern front collapsed, pushing Allied commanders to orchestrate a general withdrawal to avoid total disaster amid the harsh Korean winter. Early 1951 brought yet another dramatic shift. On January 4th, combined Chinese and North Korean forces launched a broad offensive, reclaiming Seoul for the second time since the war began. Command and civilian evacuations occurred in great haste, leaving behind confusion and dismay. Meanwhile, General Walton Walker's December 1950 death led to General Matthew Ridgway taking charge. He reorganized UN forces and strengthened defensive lines along the Han River. In the ensuing months, with fresh international reinforcements and more coordinated operations, the UN mounted a gradual counterattack. By February, Allied lines solidified south of Seoul, slowing the Chinese advance. U.S. artillery and armor shipments, Turkish infantry units, and other national contingents on the ground helped reduce enemy pressure. By March, the Allies' renewed offensive succeeded in retaking Seoul, reversing the conflict's momentum once again. Yet the front soon settled around the 38th parallel, creating a military stalemate. Repeated attempts at breakthrough by both sides failed, dragging the combat into a war of attrition. This deadlock foreshadowed the protracted negotiations that would dominate the remainder of the war. as neither camp could achieve a decisive victory. In the end, Korea became locked in a precarious balance, marking a pivotal stage of the Cold War. In under a year, the Korean peninsula witnessed frontline reversals, international interventions, and epic battles that redefined the Cold War's trajectory. Yet the story doesn't end here. Tensions kept mounting, culminating in decisions and clashes that would draw in military and political leaders alike, forever altering the peninsula's future. In the spring of 1951, General Douglas MacArthur pressed for a nuclear strike against Manchuria. What if President Harry Truman had yielded to this extreme demand? Instead, Truman chose to contain the conflict and fire MacArthur, removing him from command and making a decisive turning point in the Korean War. Thus, the war averted the specter of large-scale atomic devastation and followed the course we know today. But at what cost? And under what sacrifices? Replacing MacArthur was General Matthew Ridgway, entrusted with a more cautious yet equally resolute strategy. Meanwhile, the front began stabilizing around the 38th parallel, heralding the end of mobile warfare. UN forces and Sino-North Korean units now faced each other in static positions, marked by trenches, fortifications, and long coils of barbed wire. This fresh phase, often likened to World War I trench combat, proved extremely grueling. The battlefield equilibrium, along with a political desire to avoid nuclear escalation, confirmed that MacArthur's total offensive belonged to the past. The Korean War entered a costly stalemate in both resources and human lives, revealing neither side would dare spark another cataclysm. By mid-1951, it was evident this conflict would stay contained, yet protracted. In July 1951, as UN and Sino-North Korean armies faced off along a 240-kilometer front near the 38th parallel, representatives of the United States, China, and North Korea convened in Panmunjom, a village around 8 kilometers from Kaesong, to seek an armistice. On the ground, tens of thousands of soldiers fought in entrenched lines, even as negotiators strove to end a conflict that had already claimed hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded. The talks quickly revealed major sticking points. First came the precise boundary line to define the demarcation zone. Second, the fate of more than 100,000 prisoners of war, many of whom rejected forced repatriation. China and North Korea demanded the return of every POW, whereas the United States and its allies preferred voluntary repatriation. Additionally, no side wished to appear weak to domestic audiences, inflaming the already tense atmosphere at the table. Despite these negotiations, combat persisted. Casualties mounted daily along ridges and outposts, some just 30 or 40 kilometers from Panmunjom itself. The stark contrast between the battlefield's brutality and the formality of diplomatic talks slowed any progress, ensuring the path to an armistice would be long and fraught. The positional warfare, coupled with the difficulties of these discussions, would shape the following 2 years of conflict, leaving both sides locked in a costly deadlock that tested their endurance and resolve on every hill and trench across the landscape, underscoring how complex peace could ultimately be. Throughout a roughly 240-kilometer front, at least 100 hills changed hands multiple times amid extended clashes. Over 40 large-scale operations repeatedly altered tactical maps. On one side, UN forces, led by the United States and comprising various allies. On the other, determined Sino-North Korean troops resolved to hold firm. Seizing a ridge conferred control over the surrounding valleys, vital for supply routes and strategic maneuvers. Yet every new assault ran into trenches, fortified positions, and both sides' steadfast refusal to yield ground. Among the most notorious battles were Bloody Ridge, August to September 1951, and Heartbreak Ridge, September to October 1951, both on the eastern sector. At Bloody Ridge, fighting centered on hills 983 and 924, strategic for artillery firing and observation. Its estimated UN forces, mainly American and South Korean, suffered over 2,700 losses, while Sino-North Korean casualties surpassed 15,000 killed or wounded. A few weeks later, Heartbreak Ridge focused on hills 931 and 851, with American losses near 3,700 versus over 25,000 among defenders. Conditions were dire. Monsoon rains turned slopes to mud. Mountainous terrain encouraged subterranean bunkers and tunnels, while UN forces resorted to heavy aerial bombardment, often with napalm, to flush out defenders. Despite air superiority, Sino-North Korean infantry, driven by Mao Zedong's and Kim Il-sung's political resolve, kept counterattacking and inflicted severe losses. In this setting, capturing or losing a hill might yield only a few hundred meters, yet cost thousands of lives. While preliminary armistice talks began at Panmunjom, positional warfare persisted, with unrelenting back-and-forth advances and withdrawals defining the conflict until 1953. This grueling war of attrition exposed the immense human cost exacted by each engagement. Neither side would cede a critical vantage point without a fierce fight, guaranteeing that a line measuring just a few kilometers wide would become a nightmarish arena of mud, mortar barrages, and hand-to-hand combat. By late 1951, both armies understood the front might not shift significantly, yet high command demanded ongoing pressure, turning every position into a bloody prize. In 1952, the Truman administration intensified its bombing strategy against the northern areas of the Korean peninsula. The goal was to erode North Korea and China's productive capacities by destroying key infrastructure like bridges, dams, power plants, and industrial sites. Over 1,000 UN aircraft, mostly American, conducted large-scale incursions, causing severe damage and swelling the number of internal refugees. Cities and villages struck by raids saw essential services collapse, forcing civilians to flee to safer areas or seek makeshift shelter. This air campaign aimed to pressure Pyongyang and Beijing into accepting more favorable armistice terms. Meanwhile, the United States approached a presidential election. In November 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a World War II hero, won the race, ushering in fresh perspectives. During his campaign, Eisenhower vowed to resolve the forgotten war in Korea, yet did not rule out tough measures if negotiations failed. This change at the White House also affected senior UN command. New diplomatic pressure was applied on Beijing, where fears of a potential nuclear clash were mounting. American and global public opinion, weary of a protracted and costly conflict, increasingly backed a settlement. Yet Truman's resolve to use air power as diplomatic leverage remained firm until his term's end. In 1952, this so-called hammer-from-above strategy peaked. That year alone, the U.S. Air Force launched tens of thousands of missions, dropping tons of bombs on key northern facilities. Over the entire war, it would conduct nearly 800,000 sorties, delivering around 635,000 tons of ordnance, including over 32,000 tons of napalm, a quantity surpassing that used in the entire Pacific theater during World War II. This relentless bombing campaign sought to cripple North Korea's infrastructure and political will, inching closer to negotiations, but also exacting a deep humanitarian toll. Civilian centers lay in ruins, fueling bitter resentment among survivors and shaping post-war animosities profoundly. By early 1953, the War of Position had reached its peak. While Panmunjom negotiations continued in fits and starts, the front remained a chain of trenches and fortifications. The harsh 1952-53 winter made combat even more grueling, as thousands of soldiers fought in brutal sub-zero conditions. Despite intensified UN air raids and Sino-North Korean infantry offensives, the 38th parallel still marked the main dividing line with minimal territorial shifts. Amid this grinding stalemate came the Battle of Porkchop Hill, March to July 1953, emblematic of ferocious struggles over seemingly minor ridges that held immense symbolic value. Located north of Seoul, Porkchop Hill became a focal point between American troops and Chinese forces. Every meter extracted precious lives. Estimates suggest the United States lost over 1,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, while Chinese casualties ran even higher, likely several thousand. Heavy artillery, bombing runs, and massive infantry waves underscored the brutality of a conflict that now gained virtually no ground at utterly prohibitive cost. Meanwhile, conditions for an armistice gradually matured. The United States, under President Eisenhower, increased diplomatic pressure on China, threatening further military escalation or even nuclear action should talks fail. Also central were the fates of prisoners of war, particularly those refusing to return to communist-held areas, and the precise demarcation along the 38th parallel. These issues dominated the arduous discussions. Ultimately, on July 27, 1953, the Panmunjom Armistice was signed, establishing a demilitarized zone about 4 kilometers wide near the 38th parallel. Yet no formal peace treaty ever materialized, leaving the two Koreas technically at war. This agreement halted the fighting but never resolved the underlying divisions, ushering in an armed peace destined to endure for decades. Despite the carnage, the uneasy truce allowed both sides to regroup, signaling a painful legacy that shaped the peninsula's future. Millions had suffered 3 years of near-constant fighting, only to see borders hardly shift. In hindsight, the armistice was less a definitive solution than a tense pause that would cast its shadow over North Asia's geopolitics for generations, leaving both Koreas locked in unresolved rivalry. With the armistice signing in July 1953, the Korean peninsula remained split into 2 diametrically opposed political entities, linked only by the painful memory of 3 years of war. In the south, the Republic of Korea, initially authoritarian and backed by the United States, experienced an economic boom from the 1960s onward, gradually democratizing until the 1980s, when civilian governments were elected and full political freedoms emerged. In the north, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea developed as a Stalinist-style regime under Kim Il-sung, marked by personality cult, heavy militarization, and later, a nuclear program. Millions of families remained divided, while relations between the two Koreas stayed hostile, lacking any definitive peace treaty. The war, never formally concluded, became a suspended conflict that has shaped regional politics for decades, drawing in global actors like the United States, China, and Russia. Even now, the Korean War continues influencing geopolitical balances, revealing how profoundly those 3 years impacted the peninsula and the wider world. If these events moved or intrigued you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss upcoming content. Have questions, doubts, or opinions to share? Drop us a comment. Your participation helps us keep exploring the pivotal turns of world history together, unveiling the crucial legacies that still echo across today's international stage. In a region haunted by memory, we can see how old fault lines endure, ensuring the Korean question remains unresolved.